For this video, we're going to delve into the intricacies of building a flood wall, sectioned into 3 detailed scenarios. Our focus will be solely on the construction of these walls, setting aside other site-specific measures like drainage, for instance, for clarity and conciseness. You might recall a BBC feature recently about a chap, Nick Lupton, who successfully built a flood wall around his home, effectively safeguarding it against the River Severn's floods. This instance of triumph has sparked widespread interest, with many echoing the sentiment, "We need a flood wall around our home too." Our clients, often driven by the Build Back Better initiative, are increasingly inquiring about such constructions, and insurance companies want to scrutinise plans for structural robustness. A poignant reminder of the significance of sturdy and well-designed walls came during Storm Babette in Woodborough, Nottinghamshire, where I witnessed the failure of a garden wall previously serving as a homeowner's self-designed flood defence, which dramatically collapsed. This incident underscores the grave risks involved and the insurance company's valid concerns over potential catastrophic failures. Obtaining the necessary consents and structural designs can run into tens of thousands of pounds, and therefore, as always, a flood survey and risk assessment should be the first port of call to help ensure any funds are spent in the most suitable areas. It's paramount that any flood wall is not only robustly constructed but also complies with current regulations to prevent exacerbating flood risks elsewhere. Additionally, it's vital to have a grasp of the site's drainage networks prior to designing flood walls, a topic we've explored in another video accessible via the link in the description below. Simplifying the complexity, we'll navigate through 3 primary scenarios. Firstly, dealing with flooding from ordinary watercourses or surface water, and where planning permission is not required for walls or landscaping. Secondly, where flooding stems from a main river and planning permission is still not required for walls or landscaping. And thirdly, cases where planning permission is indeed necessary. Each scenario presents unique challenges and requirements. It's important that you're well informed and prepared for your flood defence project. If you have assessed the site drainage and deem a flood wall viable, a crucial step in your flood defence project is to determine the classification of the river or watercourse in question. Is it an ordinary watercourse or a main river? This vital information is readily available online and is essential for understanding the regulatory framework you'll be working within. Ordinary watercourses fall under the jurisdiction of the lead local flood authority, or LLFA, whilst main rivers are managed by the Environment Agency. If you're impacted by surface water, this would also fall under the LLFA. Next, assess whether your project requires planning permission. Generally, for a wall exceeding 1 metre in height adjacent to a highway, or over 2 metres high in other areas like a backyard, planning permission is typically necessary. If you're constructing a wall in the grounds of a listed building, you will require planning permission. If your house is located in a conservation area, you may also require planning permission. In such instances, consulting with your local planning authority is a prudent step to ensure compliance with specific area regulations. Our first case is surface water or an ordinary watercourse where planning is not needed. This falls realistically under the Land Drainage Act. Now, land drainage is a complex area of responsibility. If your activity is on an ordinary watercourse, you may need land drainage consent, or to follow local council or internal drainage board bylaws. As the riparian owner, you do have a right to protect your property from flooding, but you must obtain permissions from the appropriate risk management authorities to carry out work in or around the watercourse. Damages may be claimed against you if any development increases the flood risk for others. There are, of course, other areas where you may not be on an ordinary watercourse or be a riparian owner, but of course still wish to build defences, and this same approach would still apply. Our approach in this area is that generally the authorities are open to such development if the proposal can be shown that it will not impact on others. However, we have found LLFA's approaches different across the country. In various situations we have experienced, lead local flood authorities have offered comprehensive feedback and specified certain prerequisites that must be met to their satisfaction before endorsing such proposals. In other cases, we have experienced where the lead local flood authority will review plans and comment on them, but comment that although they do not have any fundamental objections, cannot offer an unequivocal rubber-stamped approval. This caution is due to the possibility that if a neighbour were to raise an objection and demonstrate that the impact of the project could be detrimental, the responsibility for any legal dispute would fall directly between the project initiator and the neighbour, not involving the council. Essentially, whilst the lead local flood authority might not oppose the plans initially, they cannot guarantee immunity from potential future legal challenges from others affected by the project. It is therefore a key consideration when designing flood walls that there isn't a negative impactor. The key factor we have experienced has always been around impacting or not impacting the flow path, and an exceedance flow path should not be interrupted. For example, if water flowed across your land to re-enter a watercourse, building a wall could impact this and unfortunately could negatively impact other people. This is usually a bigger consideration than the simple displacement of floodwater, which can often be managed through providing compensatory storage, or in rural areas, it might not impact other properties. For our second case, if you want to build defences for a flood caused by main river flooding, there are established permits and processes to follow. You may need an environmental permit if you do an activity that could pollute the air, water or land, increase flood risk or adversely affect land drainage. And you're breaking the law if you operate without a permit when you should have one. You may need an environmental permit for flood risk activities if you do work, for instance, in, under, over or near a main river, including where the river is in a culvert, on or near a flood defence on a main river, in the floodplain of a main river, on or near a sea defence. These permits were known formally as Flood Defence Consents, or FDCs. You should check if your activity is regulated. I have covered the areas I believe are key, but this is not fully exhaustive, so please review the Environment Agency website. This was also only up to date as of the filming of this video. You may need to apply for permission to do any of the following regulated flood risk activities, which could be building or altering any permanent or temporary structure designed to contain or divert floodwaters from a main river, any activity within 8 metres of the bank of a main river or 16 metres if it's tidal, any activity within 8 metres of a flood defence structure or culvert on a main river or 16 metres if it's tidal, activities carried out on the floodplain of a main river more than 8 metres from the riverbank culvert or flood defence structure, or 16 metres if it's tidal, if you do not have planning permission. Activities that you do not need permission before you start work. So you do not need to get permission if you plan to do one of the excluded activities, but you must operate within the description and conditions of the exclusion. Now, one exclusion which is relevant is flood protection devices attached to buildings. You can install door boards, air brick covers, and attach other flood protection devices to buildings without a permit. If your activity is not excluded, then you need permission before you start. And there are 3 ways to get permission to do your work. You can either register for an exemption, where you do not need a permit, but you must still register your exemption. You can apply for a standard rules permit, which includes a standard set of fixed rules for common activities, or you can apply for a bespoke permit for all other flood risk activities. And those permits are tailored to the risks from your activities. Within building a wall and flood risk management, I see 2 for consideration, and that's either exemption or bespoke. The relevant exemption we have identified is the ability to construct raised flood defences around a maximum of 6 adjoining properties. This exemption can be used, for example, to build around a pair of semi-detached houses and is under FRA 26. But before you register this, you must check your activity meets all of the following conditions. Firstly, you cannot carry out the activity within 8 metres of a main river. The dimensions of the flood defences must be no more than 1 metre high and 6 metres wide, and the defences must be at least 20 metres from any building not owned by the owners of the properties. The total area protected of the defences is no more than 150 metres squared for each property, and the defences are to protect existing buildings within the existing boundary of the properties. If it doesn't fall under that, otherwise you're likely to need a bespoke permit, where your activities would be assessed and you're likely to be required to show that you're not making flood risk worse elsewhere. You may be required to provide compensatory storage. You must apply for a bespoke permit if your activities do not fit within any of the standard rules, exemptions or exclusions. So compensatory storage in terms of flood risk management, particularly in the UK, refers to a technique used in floodplain development to mitigate the impact of construction on flood risk. Where development takes place, or a flood wall on a floodplain, it can reduce the natural capacity of the area to store floodwater, potentially increasing flood risk elsewhere. To counteract this, compensatory storage involves creating an equivalent volume of storage for floodwater elsewhere within the same catchment. This is achieved by excavating or lowering land levels in nearby locations to create additional space for floodwater during events. The principle behind this is to ensure that any loss of flood storage due to development is compensated for by providing additional storage. And obviously that depends on the catchment and the area, which is why it would be a bespoke permit. If your proposals require planning permission, it's likely that you would need to submit a flood risk assessment with the planning application for the works. This assessment should thoroughly assess the risk and provide an understanding of whether this could increase the risk for others, and if not, how this is being managed on the site. It would also be vital as part of this assessment that the wall was built to the suitable height for the flood risk. If the flood risk assessment, or FRA, concludes that there's no increased risk for others or it can be effectively managed on site, it must clearly detail the strategies and measures being employed for this purpose. Depending on the specific location of your project and the level of detail required by the Environment Agency and the Planning Department, you might also be required to undertake detailed flood modelling, which is why this can get very expensive. The requirement for such modelling is contingent upon the complexity of the flood risk in your area and the degree of examination the application will undergo by the regulatory authorities. Beyond the flood risk, you should also consider the environmental impact of the construction, which includes assessing potential impacts on wildlife, vegetation, and the broader ecosystem. Mitigation strategies should be outlined to minimise any negative environmental consequences. You may need to include an emergency response plan in case of flood wall failure or unexpected flooding scenarios, and this plan should detail evacuation routes, communication strategies, and emergency services coordination. Given the complexity of navigating this and the potential costs involved, it's vital to seek suitable advice early on. I will caveat this video that this is my experience and my understanding. However, you should seek advice in your specific area from the Environment Agency, Lead Local Flood Authority, Planning Authority, or even Specialist Land Drainage Act lawyers. If you're looking at building a flood wall and want to discuss it further, please do get in touch. We will be able to help you get through the necessary stages with your project and make sure that the flood defence scheme is going to work as you expect it to. As I mentioned in a different video, as we've shared in the link below, the drainage is so important to consider. There's no point putting up a flood wall if drainage is going to backflow underneath it. So you need to consider everything holistically. We'll be doing more of these videos to keep you up to date on the latest flood risk activities, how to protect yourself. Be sure to check out some of our other videos, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. We'll see you soon.